Welcome, everyone, to part 2 of this 3-part series on healing racism, embracing diversity in ourselves, our communities, and the world with Dr. Tiffany Jana, author, educator, entrepreneur, diversity innovator, regenerative culture creator, and the founder of TMI Consulting. My name's Tami Simon. I'm the founder of Sounds True. And it's an honor, and it warms my heart, and it's a delight, truly, and a challenge, I would say, to be your host for this series. And I want to welcome you, Sounds True authors, members of our Sounds True staff, the family members of our Sounds True staff, our whole extended online community, partner organizations. Thank you for coming along with us. This is the beginning of a 2-year deep dive into diversity, equity, and inclusion training that we're doing at Sounds True. This is the public introductory part of that training. And I thank you for joining us for this part and the fact that we can walk together in our learning. Tonight, we're going to be talking in the second part of our series about embracing diversity in our communities. But before we get to that, I want to both welcome Dr. Jana and ask a couple follow-up questions from last week's session. So Dr. Jana, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much for having me back. It's such an honor.
Okay, here we go. Here's the big question, and it's my question. It's the question that I was left with after last week. At the very end of our session, we asked you 3 principles that you live by. And you said just 3, but then you went ahead and answered and you offered 3. Moving in grace, the first one for yourself, grace for yourself and for others. The third principle was staying connected to source. But it's the second one that I wanted to ask you about. You said the third principle that you live by is liberation through joy. Liberation through joy. And quite honestly, of all the things that left an imprint on me from our first session, a kind of energetic imprint, it was this sense of liberation through joy. I mean, I think so many people, when they hear a series like Healing Racism, the last thing they associate with it is any kind of joy. And yet somehow being with you and seeing things from your perspective, it liberated joy in me, and I think a lot of our viewers. So talk about that. What is liberation through joy to you?
Liberation through joy is a framework that was gifted to us all by author. This is a queer author of color. This is Adrienne Maree Brown, the author of Emergent Strategy and Pleasure Activism specifically. So liberation through joy is the core tenet of pleasure activism. And it from the macro to the micro, as a Black, non-binary, LGBT, invisibly disabled person, the world is not oriented towards my joy. So just being who I am and having a smile on my face, just being who I am and cultivating and breathing joy is a radical act of revolution. So that is, in its smallest sense, liberating myself through my own joy, because again, the world's not oriented towards Black joy, towards Black liberation. In the macro, it goes all the way from that individual sense of freedom and delight to liberating the hearts and minds of people through the expression of joy and the identification with joy. It is so important that we find the things that give us life. If we think about this moment in the midst of COVID, in the midst of this racial upheaval, it is so imperative that we find our joy and breathe into it. Otherwise, we do run the risk of being, overwhelmed by what is happening, by the emotion, by the stress of it all. But it moves all the way through the liberation of Black bodies. If we think about mass incarceration, if we think about all of the different ways that people are oppressed, and in my case, Black people are oppressed and people of color, joy is one of the vehicles that we use to free people from even the physical cages, not just the metaphysical cages.
Okay, well, I'm really inspired by this, which is why I want to ask a follow-up question, which is, for a lot of people, myself, I'll speak for myself, it's not natural for me to necessarily feel joyful. It doesn't feel natural when I'm dealing with heavy issues, heavy topics, my own heaviness. So how do you do it, Dr. Jana?
I mean, I definitely have an unfair advantage. I believe that my natural orientation has always been joy. For those of us who are familiar with the Enneagram personality typology, I am an Enneagram 7. I am the enthusiast, so it is much easier for me because I'm oriented towards turning away from the darkness, turning away from the pain. For me, the discipline is to look in that direction because it is much, much harder for me. That said, all of us have the capacity to cultivate joy. And as I said, I think that it's an imperative part of really of enjoying and embracing the human condition. If we think about our purpose for being, I think that experiencing why if we are spirits inhabiting these physical bodies, I think that part of the purpose of the inhabitants is to experience joy in so many different dimensions. And part of the adventure of our lifetime is, where are all the places that we can find joy? And there are thousands of things that we can do in the meantime with those expressions. But I do think that cultivating that that childlike freedom, the sound of a child laughing, is among the most glorious sounds that any of us can ever bear witness to. And that is something that, as we move away from childhood, it's easy to get bogged down in adulting and the stress of it. But I think that childhood joy is a birthright and a legacy to which we are all entitled.
Okay, and one other follow-up question. This comes from one of our listeners who wrote in the first webinar, you called color blindness a dangerous concept because Blackness is a primary part of your identity. If we encourage people to think of their race as essential to their sense of self, won't this cause more tribalism and ultimately racism?
So it's not about encouraging people to think of it as central. We can't get away from that. Like it is just part of the reality. When the entire world order that we experience has been constructed around the delusion of white supremacy, every reinforcing message that I get from media, from society, from the world, from the people around me, tells me over and over again that whiteness is wonderful, that whiteness is beautiful, that whiteness is intelligent, that whiteness equals leadership. So it's not about encouraging people to do that. That is the reality in which we live. And so one of the countermeasures to the identity association that causes harm if you are not white is to fully embrace the beauty and the joy and the glory that is inherent within each of our identities. The whole world can tell me all day, every day, how incredibly wonderful and superior whiteness is according to this delusion. And I don't care. Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. I am very, very much fully inhabited in the idea that my Blackness is real because it is what people see and it is part of my identity, and that it's beautiful and that it's wonderful and that it is glorious and that it is capable of all of the things that humans are capable of. So I think joy and pride and honoring what we are and where we come from is important. And that and it to me it is the most effective countermeasure against so many narratives that try to tell us otherwise.
All right, we're going to move into the theme now of our second part of this series, embracing diversity in our communities, which includes our families, in our circles of friends, in our neighborhoods, our workplaces. And I wanted to start, Dr. Jana, do you have any guiding principles, we could say best practices, for having difficult conversations about race, just in general, having difficult conversations about race?
So it is such an incredibly touchy and difficult subject. I think that it is essential that we tap into the values that we share. And I find this to be useful in difficult conversations about anything that has the potential to polarize us. I think that finding the shared values between myself and the person that I am attempting to communicate with, if we start from that place, then we can build out something that is strong, that is honest, that is inclusive, that is caring, that is empathetic. So I say, find the things that we know we both believe in and build out from there.
Okay, we're going to start by talking about embracing diversity in our families. And we received a lot of questions that basically went something like this. And this is from a Sounds True employee who wrote in, how do we begin to talk to racist family members about the harm they're creating through their beliefs and actions?
Oh, this is such a good one. So I put this under the framework of Racist Uncle Bob. And we talk about this in my very first book, Overcoming Bias, Building Authentic Relationships Across Differences. And it is, again, so that central tenet that I stated earlier about finding the common values. First of all, I'm glad that you want to have that conversation, because many people run from that conversation because they don't want the discomfort of it, and they're afraid of breaking the relationship. But finding that place of shared values and leveraging the power of the loving relationship that exists, of the familial bond that exists, is so important. Because if you, someone who loves Racist Uncle Bob, aren't going to be the one to challenge his notions, well, who the heck else is going to? Because he's not going to listen to me. So he's more likely to listen to you. So the way that you have those conversations is, again, identify the things that you know Bob values and start from there. And if you move from a place of curiosity, so oftentimes when we have differing views and we want to talk about, things like racism, we become very self-righteous. We know that we're right. We know that the other person is wrong, and we want to convince them of our place. And the way that we build constructs in our minds, when you attack my worldview and my construct, my brain is just automatically going to double down, and I will not be able to hear even the most rational argument. Like, you're literally fighting people's physiology, and it's a fruitless effort. So what you want to do is you want to move in the spirit of curiosity, and the extent to which you can make that a genuine movement. If you care about this person and you genuinely believe that they are causing harm with their words, their actions, and their beliefs, then seek to understand Racist Uncle Bob. And when you move through that place and you say, Bob, I really want to talk to you about this, because I heard what you said, and I think very differently from you. I really want to understand where you're coming from, because, I've known you my whole life. I love you, whatever it is, make it real. But heart to heart extension of human spirit. I want to see things from your perspective, because I really don't see them that way. And I'd love to know why. And the fascinating thing about people's beliefs and values and energies, when they are harmful and negative, when you allow them to attempt to justify the place from whence they are operating, it becomes really difficult, like extremely difficult, for them to genuinely rationalize those perspectives. You just let Bob dig and dig and dig, and eventually he hits a bottom, and you're in a place where you can say, well, interesting. And then you can begin to share your perspective, because those positions, when you operate from the place of the shared value, right? There's goodness in Bob. He believes that he's a good person. He's trying to be a good person. He's got bad information. But when you have the shared value of, people should be allowed to live free or love their families or take care or provide, whatever it is, and then you allow him to explain himself, you'll be able to find a new intersection where you'll understand a little more about where he's coming from, and he will have a platform from whence he can begin to see your perspective.
Can you take that example and play it out and show me how Racist Uncle Bob starts to see your perspective in that dialogue?
Yeah, so Racist Uncle Bob will say things like, freedom of speech, I'm allowed to have my perspective, white, all lives matter. And, I don't understand, like this, none of this makes sense. People are just, people are too sensitive, and we should be, we have statues coming down in Richmond right now. We should be able to, have our statues up however we want. If we say to Bob, I agree with you, Bob, that, people should be able to communicate, and that honoring our families is something that is really important. But I would say at that point, do you understand like that the African American people, they also want to honor their families. They also want to honor their families, and they also want to have the freedoms of being American and all of the freedoms that affords. And part of the reason that people are marching in the street right now is because their freedoms are being compromised. People who are also American are not allowed to just go jogging down the street or just shop at a store. And what they're defending is their freedom. And, what those statues communicate to Black people is that the plight of their ancestors, the murder and the genocide of their ancestors, it doesn't actually really matter. And so while no one wants to erase the history, I think that it's important that we look at everyone's history, right? Because we're not going to say that anyone's history is more important. Black people have families that they want to honor, and Black people have freedoms that they want protected, just like we want to honor our families and we want to have our freedoms protected.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now labeling someone a racist. First of all, what does it mean for someone to be a racist, to have truly earned that label?
So I really appreciate Ibram X. Kendi's treatment of this in How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's in one of his more recent books. And what I appreciate about Kendi's treatment is that he removes this idea of racist and not racist from the binary and explains that all of us, including Black people, because there's a lot of theory out there previously that said Black people can't be racist because racism equals prejudice plus power, and Black people don't have power. And that's not universally true. So to be racist means that in any given moment, even if you consider yourself not racist, in any given moment, if you are reinforcing racist ideas, if you are harboring racist thoughts, and if you are doing things that support racist structures, these are things that in any given moment can be in support of racism. Wholly calling a human being, you are just racist and you are not racist, that's like the on binary of privilege versus not privilege. Everybody's a little bit racist. If you're in America and you grew up with the images and the things that we've all seen and experienced, you're probably harboring some racist ideas. Now, I think that in the larger scheme of things, when people say, oh, you're a racist, then you probably have a sustained track record of doing and saying things that are actively in support of racism, racist structures, racist systems. So you are upholding systems of oppression. And typically speaking, if someone's just being called a racist, then they probably have earned that by doing that with intention, right? Because even a person who considers themselves not racist can engage in racist behavior unwittingly. But I think that the racists, when people want to slap that label on, they're talking about the folks who are perfectly okay denying freedoms, denying rights, and stifling the liberation of Black people, for instance.
Okay, a couple more questions here about embracing diversity in our families. This comes from another Sounds True employee who writes, "It sounds true. We talk a lot about the value of being authentic. I can recall many frustrating and fruitless conversations that I've had with family members who feel authentic in being bigoted. How can we embrace differences when we're with others who are bigoted and show no desire to be otherwise?"
So again, sometimes people will hold beliefs. We have to figure out how they got there and why they believe that. I believe that one of the greatest sort of reinforcers of the bigoted beliefs comes from a lack of proximity. It is very easy to buy mother culture's narrative of what and who a people are when you don't have relationships with people from those representative identities, right? So it's so easy to believe the narrative that you've been fed. So I think that in those moments, that's when we as white allies, it is imperative that you challenge people in those moments. So when people say, this is what I think of Asian people, then you say, is that all Asian people, or is that a specific person that you're talking about? Just challenge it head on and just make them get very specific about what they mean and where these ideas came from. Because so many of us, when I say everybody's a little bit racist, so many of us are still harboring notions that are racist, sexist, ableist, etc. And we have no idea what the origin of these thoughts and beliefs are. And if no one ever challenges us on those, then they're not going to be purged. So we do need to call each other out, or call each other in, I prefer, right? Lovingly and empathetically call each other in and just say, you know what? I'm hearing what you're saying about, you just made that statement about Asian people. Asian people represent a very large percentage of the globe, and I'm pretty sure that you don't know all of them. And you've got to know, I know you're a good person. I've known you my whole life again, right? I've known you this long. And you have to understand that perspective, that view, that way of thinking is a little bit outdated, and will not serve you, and is not a reflection of the values that I know you hold dear.
Okay. And what if somebody says, I'm afraid to lose a relationship by calling someone in? The risk is too great. Do you think that person is just being cowardly, or do you think they may really have a point that they could lose the relationship, and the relationship's really valuable? They don't want to lose it.
No, that's not cowardly. I mean, it's not cowardly. Like, at human beings, we are not solitary creatures. Being in relationship, being seen, being understood, having that sense of belonging is core to who we are. So that is very real. However, again, with the spiritual reference, iron sharpening iron, right? We become the best versions of ourselves as we see ourselves reflected through the spirit and the honesty and integrity and kindness of another person willing to share with us who they see us as and how they see us behaving. We are woefully inept at actually understanding ourselves without that reflection. It's a necessary part of life. So if you're very afraid of losing the relationship, understand that, one, you're not going to change a deeply embedded mindset in one conversation. Like, if you can do that, I'm gonna need you to hit me up on Instagram and tell me how you did it, because girl, we can make millions of dollars together. Okay, we can save the whole world. Not gonna happen in one conversation. It is there, but for those deep, intimate relationships that we are able to leverage over time and make the incremental shifts. I just provided somebody with some support and guidance as they were doing that with a group of a family that they were living with, that they were kind of trapped with because of COVID. And, I helped them find the shared values. They came from a religious background, but don't have that religious background anymore. And this was a very religious family, and they were, having problems with, with some of the issues that we're seeing being played out on the global stage. And I pointed this person to very specific scripture that spoke to the value system, and they were able to have a conversation. And they came back and reported. They said, I cannot believe it, but they moved just a little bit, and I didn't expect any movement at all. So don't expect to purge someone of their bigotry or their racism in one conversation. Hold them in deep grace, hold them in a loving, empathetic embrace, and be patient. Have small incremental conversations, because here's the thing. If that relationship is truly so valuable and worth you being that nervous about losing, that means that they better care about you as deeply as you care about them. And if they care about you as deeply as you care about them, then you bearing your soul and saying, I love you so much, but I really don't understand this worldview that you have, and I want to, and this relationship means so much to me, but I want to keep exploring this because, I don't want there to be this thing we can't talk about, this divide between us. And if you move in an authentic sense of love and inclusion, and you're trying to understand, and these conversations cause such a rift that person's willing to cut you off, baby girl, baby boy, baby non-binary sibling, we might need to discuss your boundaries, because if standing up for what you know is right causes you to lose contact with a person, you might need to lose contact with a person, because it might be that very act of accountability that forces them to do the deep introspection and say, wow, I lost my loving relationship with this person who means so much to me because I refused to budge on something that seemed to be so very important to them. It might be that temporary loss that causes them to actually make the 180. So this is about standing up for what you believe in. What are you willing to lose? No, it's not cowardly to be afraid, but courage is not the absence of fear. Courage and integrity means doing the right thing, even though we are terrified.
Mm-hmm. You know, as I'm listening to you, Dr. Jana, what's hitting me is that people, I think, sometimes just don't have the training or the skills. Like, they just don't have the skills. Like, as you describe this all, you make it sound so easy. You know, you make it sound like the alphabet or something. It's just so intuitive to you. But I know when it comes to having these difficult conversations with people we really care about, it's like, it's a fog. It's like, well, where do I start? What do you think are the key skills that people need to develop so they can walk confidently into this?
Yeah. So again, where allies have a tendency to get tripped up is that we want to be in the teaching and preaching and explaining and converting mode, when we really need to be in the deep, soulful listening mode. We need to be hearing, right? Because what you'll find when you listen deeply, particularly to someone that you care about and you know, you'll find that at the root of most of the bigotry and most of the racism is fear. People are afraid of something. They're afraid of losing something. They're afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of these crazy narratives they've been given that Black people are scary and violent and all of these things. There's fear there. And so liberating someone from their own fear is very delicate surgical work, right? It is very difficult work. So learning how to listen very deeply and increase your empathy and compassion in those moments is important. But this is why, part of why this moment is so magical, this moment of revolution, because the other thing that you can do, your best defense, is going to be for you to have a deep and personal understanding of what all this is about. Why is it the alphabet for me? Because I've both lived and studied this, right? I've lived and studied this. So I don't care what your industry, your field, your passion, whatever it is that you're about, I can probably identify the precise manner in which racism and structural repression and just kind of holding people down has influenced your industry, has influenced the things that you care about. So the more you study and the more you understand, then it becomes easier for you to have these conversations and say, oh, well, Uncle Bob, are you aware of this? Now, you can't start there. You can't start as a teacher preacher. You must listen first. But if you're able to, once you identify the fear and you identify the concerns, if you're able to then weave in a narrative that is based in reality, that is based in history, and more importantly, based in the personal lived experiences of the people around you, it becomes a very different exercise.
Okay, as a parent, and I know you have 3 children, how do you raise children who fully embrace diversity?
Ah, yes. I was telling you about this before we got online. So like one of the things is the very first instinct that parents have around race and racism is to protect their children from the realities, protect the children from the ideas of the violence, from the ideas that people are different, the colorblind, right? We want our children to be colorblind. We don't want to instill these weird things into them. Well, the problem is that if you don't actually talk to children about race and racism, then our culture will educate them. And for white parents, that means that because the default operating code for our present culture is one that supports the delusion of white supremacy, if you're not sharing your personal and family values with your children, you will by default create racist children. Because the narratives that they're going to get from everywhere are going to say that their whiteness is superior in every conceivable way. So I know people don't want to talk to their kids about this because they don't feel adequately educated. Share with them what you know. Share with them what you understand. Share with them the fact that you believe that all people are created equal and that no one is better than anyone because of the color of their skin or their sexual orientation or any other aspect of their identity. They need to hear that from you because they will be challenged every step of their upbringing. And they will pick those things up. So you do want to be able to see and acknowledge when you see, a Black child who has got beautiful brown skin. It's okay to say, look at that beautiful little girl. Look at her beautiful brown skin. And when you see a child be helpful or kind on the playground, you should point that out, because the world is going to point out the myriad ways that Black people do things wrong. They're going to point that out. Very few instances will you see of ordinary people calling out ordinary things and saying, wow, what a wonderful child, what a wonderful little person. So we need to be honest with our children. And if you're worried about your own journey and your lack of expertise, bring your children on the journey with you. What is more powerful than a parent saying to a child, you know what? There's a lot of things going on in the world and I don't understand them all. Everything has to be scaffolded for age appropriateness. You don't show a 3-year-old George Floyd's lynching. No, but you do let a 3-year-old know that everybody is beautiful and everybody is worthy and that nobody's better than anyone else. And we treat everyone with kindness all the time, full stop. When that child gets to be 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, you can say, you know what? We're going to learn about racism together. Like our country has a crazy history. We did some things that were not very nice. And some of those things are still hurting Black people and brown people. And we're going to learn about some things together. Let your child see a responsible white ally taking that work on and doing it with them. That is one of the most powerful things that you can do. So just model the journey.
Okay, expanding now to embracing diversity in our neighborhoods and with our friends. We received this question from someone in Chicago, Illinois, who wrote in, what's a positive approach when talking with resistant friends who have yet to admit the effects of white privilege? I try to gently discuss it, but I could use some help so that my friends can really get it.
So in all of my books, one, I always tell people to start with themselves, and I take the dose of my own medicine. Every single one of my books, you will find more information about me and my personal life than you ever never wanted to know, because the way that we influence people in that kind of way, which is deeply personal, the power of narrative, the power of storytelling. Human beings, our brains are wired to receive information and for our hearts to be moved through the power of the story, through the power of the narrative. So in that case, nothing is more powerful than you as a white person doing the work and sharing your journey with them. So it's not a lecture. It's not, it's not an academic perspective. It is your lived experience. So a couple of a good example of this is Jenna Arnold just wrote Raising Our Hands. It's basically a guide for white women who are trying to become more informed and engaged in this space. She happens to be a white woman, and throughout her book, her narrative, she exposes her own journey grappling with the reality of racism and white supremacy and how she's benefited and sort of the responsibility that she's taken for becoming an ally, in this newest and most evolved form of herself. That is a gift to all humanity, but the gift to our friends is to show them that this person who they love, this person who they know, who's just a regular Jane like them, also struggled with the same thing. And here's what I did, and here's how I've come through. Now, here's the thing. You might not change anybody or anybody's mind, and you have to be prepared for that. Like that might not be the gift that is exchanged in that relationship. But the best way for you to try is to share your own journey.
Okay. And another person writes in, my friends and I have a lot in common. Similar socioeconomic status, similar interests. I sense that I'm missing out on diversity in my friendship circle and in my community. But truth be told, I don't know how to go about increasing the diversity without it feeling forced?
Ooh, that's a good one. That is a good one. Yeah, you are fighting against our times because we are so incredibly socially what do you call it? We're isolated from each other and we're segregated from each other. So yeah, the diversification of your friend group is something that happens with a real intention because the bubble is real in America right now. So it's difficult because it does seem really awkward to show up in places and be like, hey, brown person, you want to be my friend? Yeah, it's like, yeah, okay. So what the invitation for you to do, and I think I talk about this in my first book as well, in Overcoming Bias, is if you are surrounded by people who are just like you all the time, then you're not putting yourself in the right places. You need to start showing up in places where everyone doesn't have the same socioeconomic level as you, where people don't have the same education as you. You actually are going to have to be comfortable being uncomfortable and find yourself in spaces where you are in the minority, in some kind of minority. And you cannot show up in a weird performative way trying to collect brown friends. We are not Pokemon trading cards. But you can, but you can, what I would do is start with your passions and interests, right? So, sounds true, right? So let's say we're into books, right? There are author openings. There are, book clubs, readings, things like this. There are all kinds of things that you can participate in that are maybe centering authors of color, that are maybe centering stories that are not the ones that you are accustomed to. If you find yourself in the places where we are celebrating and gathering around people, spirits, voices that are unlike your own, if you're genuinely connecting around something that you already care about, then it's a very easy thing. Then you just show up in places where people care about similar things. Maybe just the main characters aren't all white. So that would be my advice, is to get uncomfortable, get yourself in a place where you're in the minority, but just so that it's not an awkward Pokemon brown people collecting experiment, do it around something that you already care about.
All right, let's talk about the workplace. I have many, many questions about this. I realize we'll only be able to scratch the surface here, but scratch we will. You've written a book, Subtle Acts of Exclusion: How to Understand, Identify, and Stop Microaggressions. So to begin with, what are subtle acts of exclusion? And are they the same as microaggressions, or something different, or just a different way of referring to microaggressions?
Yes. So my co-author, Michael Barron, and I wanted to rebrand the term microaggressions because just like calling someone a racist, the term microaggressions, it's got aggression in the moniker, right? So, as soon as you put that out there, people get defensive. And we wanted to find something that was a more value neutral, just descriptor of the phenomenon. So subtle acts of exclusion, we use the term SAE for short, is the same thing as a microaggression. And what it is it is a word, action, or behavior that often it is not intended to cause any harm, but does actually serve to exclude or push people to the margins. So they're often couched as compliments, is one of the common ways that we see microaggressions show up. An example that everyone seems to love from the book is the example of calling a Black public speaker articulate, right? So it's happened to me many, many times. I'm a professional speaker. I'm an author, all of these other things. So you would imagine that, if I'm being paid to stand on a stage in front of hundreds or thousands of people, that I probably know how to speak well. But when a white person says to a Black person, whether they're a public speaker or not, oh my gosh, that was so great, you're so articulate, it is considered a microaggression or a subtle act of exclusion by Black people because it demonstrates your bias, your unconscious bias, that you did not expect this Black person to be able to speak clearly and well, right? So if a white male CEO and known public speaker gets off of a stage, articulate is not usually the the adjective that is used to describe that person. Of course, you expect that person to be able to speak well. They're a public speaker, or they're a CEO, or they happen to be a white leader. And so while attempting to, pay a compliment, if we're not aware of our own biases and we're not aware of some of these social cues, and we don't have a lot of cultural fluency or contact with people from certain demographics, white people who've been around a lot of Black people tend to know this one, right? There are a couple things we don't do. We don't call Black people articulate. We don't touch Black people's hair, right? These are among the top two. So yeah, subtle acts of exclusion are just those things that we do. So on the gender spectrum, we see, if you think about the board meeting or otherwise, a group of people back when we were allowed to be in the same room, everyone pulls up a chair, we sit down and realize, oh, someone needs to take notes. And someone says, you know what, Catherine, will you go ahead and take notes for us? Oh, and Jennifer, could you get us some coffee? Right? Microaggression. Why are we assuming that the women in the room are going to take the notes and going to serve us coffee? So what does an ally do in that moment? What we Jennifer and Susan or whoever I said are not going to, they shouldn't have to be the ones that say, oh, hey, no, I don't want to get you your coffee. What would be ideal would be for Jonathan to say, oh, you know what? I'll take notes, and maybe pull the person aside who said that later and just say, hey, man, I know what you were thinking over there, but just expecting the women to serve us in various capacities is not appropriate. That's some Mad Men 1950s nonsense.
Okay, so give me some more examples in the workplace of subtle acts of exclusion that relate to race that I might not be aware of.
Sure. Anytime that we think or say that a Black woman is angry, right? Unless this Black woman has, flipped an actual table and thrown out explicatives and yelled at people, then generally speaking, if a Black woman communicates with passion and vigor, people just assume that that is an angry Black woman and that is problematic in the workplace. Well, that is actually a cultural communication style. I get very animated when I speak. My eyebrows go up, I wave my hands around, do all of these things, gesticulate, and that is not a sign of my anger. That is actually a sign of my passion. That is a sign of my commitment to the cause. When I'm actually angry, you'll know. So referring to Black women as angry, that is one. There is a people actually expect for Black people to conform to a visual standard that is a white standard. So it is a subtle act of exclusion to make commentary or in any way diminish or degrade the appearance of a Black person based on their, cultural expression, the kind of earrings I wear, the way that I wear my hair, my wardrobe. We actually have had to pass a set of laws called the Crown Act that allow Black people to go to work wearing the hair that grows out of our heads, because our bodies were legislated, and it came from the microaggressive stance that something is wrong with the way that we show up because our hair is not just straight. So when we talk about, so there is Ebonics was a way that people referred to the way that Black people speak. And it's actually the African-American common vernacular. In the rest of the world and in most of the country, when a group of people commonly speak in a similar way, it's just called a dialect or an accent. But there are a great many people who have negative things to say about the way that Black people speak, when that is actually part of a cultural expression, which is why so many Black people use the concept and the term code switching, where we speak and behave in a more white manner, because when we show up using our cultural expression, we get, all kinds of, looks and negative comments, and actually lose opportunities. Like, I've seen people choose not to hire someone because, well, this is a customer service position and we can't have someone answering the phone who sounds like that. Who sounds like what? They have a whole degree. They are an intelligent person, but they speak in a manner that is culturally indicative of who they are, but it is a whole microaggression to, to comment on that and to somehow think that that's lesser.
Mm-hmm. Now, what I noticed coming up for me as I listen to you describe subtle acts of exclusion, and I think about things I might say with an innocent nature or an innocent heart, like, your hair looks so beautiful today, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Not thinking, oh, I'm about to offend somebody, but
Mm-hmm.
it's taken the wrong way.
Mm-hmm.
It's taken the wrong way in that moment, and it's taken as offensive. And then what that brings up for me is maybe I should just keep my mouth shut and not say anything about a Black woman's hair ever. Like, do not comment, even if it's drop dead gorgeous, Tami. Keep it to yourself. So I'm curious just to hear a little bit more about that, because I think we can get into a place where it's like better not to talk about these things.
Yeah. So, if we're referring to it as beautiful, generally speaking, that is not a problem. The problem with calling a Black woman's hair beautiful is that it frequently is followed by a hand grab, right? So you can call it beautiful from a distance, just don't touch it, because we're not chia pets, right? So that is a really common response, right? It is no matter how hard I try, someone is going to take offense, so I'm just going to back down. And this is why this moment is so miraculous, because no one gets culturally fluent without effort. So there are two primary vehicles that are going to support you on your journey of becoming more culturally fluent and avoiding these moments. And one of them is proximity and relationships with actual people, who are different from you. And the other one is the self-education journey that you've got to go on in order to do this. I wish that I could say that there was a hack, that there was an easier way or a shortcut, but it just is the work that we have to do. And it is certainly worthwhile work. I have to say it all the time, and I say it every day. I'm a diversity professional. I'm considered a thought leader and expert and a best-selling author of many books on this topic. I screw it up every day. I get my own pronouns wrong. I say things that are offensive. I talk to groups of people, and I still say guys way too often. It's just, I'm old enough to have this stuff, this code that's bad, but I don't stop trying, right? So the last time I called a group of people guys, I called myself out and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Like, everyone, folks, right? The South gave us a great replacement. Just use folks. So understand, you've got to just embrace the fact that you're going to mess it up. But the messing up should not be the focal point. It should be the willingness to grow, the willingness to accept correction, right? It is a gift. It is a sacred and beautiful gift when someone is willing to say to you, oh, hey, Tami, pump the brakes, sister, right? This thing that you did or said, really, it's kind of offensive to me. Our immediate human response, and no one can help this, it is just normal. Your immediate response is to get deeply defensive and be like, but no, I didn't mean it that way. We've got to curb that response, recognize that you're going to go through that journey, move that journey aside and say, you know what, Tiffany, I'm sorry. That is totally not what I meant. I am sorry. Thank you for pointing this out to me. And, please continue to help me. Let me know what else that I can do. So totally normal to have that response. But if you give up, I will revoke your ally card. Anyone who gives up because they stumble and fall, you're going to get your ally card taken away, because I don't get to take off my Black. I don't get to take off my queer. I don't get to take off my disability. I've got to stumble through it. And it is way hostile out here for people who are, just one identity, much less intersectional. So if my allies are giving up because they trip, I'm like, I'm gonna challenge the privilege and say, yeah, it must be nice to be able to just stop talking to Black people. We can't just stop talking to white people. We're surrounded.
Mm-hmm. Okay, continuing on. You've created a subtle acts of exclusion accountability system. And we're not going to be able to go into the whole system, but there's a couple of points that you make that I want to underscore and have you comment on. When you do call out this subtle act of exclusion, you talk about first pausing, saying, ouch, that hurt, something like that. And then this is the part I really wanted you to comment on. Assuming good intent from the person who has made this comment. And then you explain why the action was paused and have patience, but expect progress. That's the 4 parts that you describe for the guidelines for speaking up about a subtle act of inclusion if it's affected you or you're observing it. Assuming good intent, that's a really big deal, Dr. Jana. I don't see that very often. I think often people don't assume good intent. That's a big move. So I want you to comment on it.
So I just want to back up and explain to
Please.
people that the SAE accountability system is designed for workplaces, right?
Yeah.
So in the workplace, what we do is from the leadership level on down, we make an agreement and we say, we know that SAEs or microaggressions are going to happen, right? They're going to happen, but they're not going to break us. What we are going to do is we're going to agree that we're going to nurture a culture where when it happens, we know what to do. So we are going to call each other in. We are going to hold each other accountable, because what we want to do is we want to normalize the action of saying, "Ooh, ouch, ooh, not okay. Like this thing, not so good. Like let's talk about it." Because in an organizational environment, it is even more terrifying to speak up, because if you're a person of color, you feel like you're going to be labeled a troublemaker and you'll never get that raise, you'll never get that promotion. Nobody wants to offend the boss, right? It sounds true. Nobody wants to tell Tami that they committed a microaggression, right? Because that could not bode well for you. So if Tami or anybody else in the organizational leadership says, all right, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a culture where the expectation is that we're going to talk about it. We're going to get through it together. We're going to name the thing and we're going to keep moving forward. So that's what the SAE accountability system is. So once we've established that baseline, that we are going to do something about it, then the idea of assuming good intent goes back to what I talked about in the principles that I live by: grace for self and grace for other. And in this case, it's grace for the other. Assuming good intent means, if you think about the defensive response that everyone has when they get called out, it's, well, that's not what I meant. Like, I'm sorry, you took it wrong. That's not what I meant. Most of us are not trying to move through the world intentionally causing harm. Like, we don't wake up in the morning and go, today I'm going to really piss off Tami on that webinar we're doing. That's not what happens. We're just stumbling through life, doing the best that we can. And sometimes we screw up. So assuming good intent means that we are just going to recognize that the person who said or did the exclusive thing, the offending thing, the microaggression, the SAE, that maybe, just maybe, they weren't setting out to ruin your day, to hurt your feelings, or diminish you and your identity. And if we start from that place of, okay, maybe this person just genuinely slipped up, then coming back together and reconciling and making the apology and accepting the apology and learning together becomes a much easier prospect. Because if I don't have to defend my personal integrity, like, let's challenge the action. Let's confront the behavior. Let's not focus on judging the individual and their character. I might say a messed up thing, I might do a messed up thing, but that does not mean that I should be canceled and disqualified as a human being forever.
And then you talked about the person who has committed the microaggression, acknowledging the feedback with lots of gratitude and replacing defensiveness with curiosity and empathy. And I have to say, that feels like a big, I mean, you mentioned people, it sounds true, aren't going to be so quick to call. Well, I get called out. And when I do, my first thing is to defend myself. That's my first move. Like, you misunderstood.
Welcome to humanity. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how am I going to get good at being curious and empathetic instead?
Oh,
my honor is at stake. My heart, that I care, that's being questioned.
Right. And so this, my dear, is the crux of the situation, right? This is the work. When I say to you and all of my white allies that you cannot shortcut the work. You cannot hack the work. There is no easy way out, right? You got to go through in order to get to the other side. You've got to have cultural and intellectual humility to learn these skills. They are muscles that have to be worked out. You literally have to practice. And so what, like if I can gift you a paradigm shifting present, it would be look for the moments where people call you out, because the wonderful thing about the atmosphere that we're in right now is more and more people are going to feel empowered to call you out. Look for those moments and program your psyche to accept deep gratitude for that gift, because that gift will cause you to grow. Every time you feel the pain of being called out and you feel your brain wanting to jump into defensiveness, you will fight that defensiveness. And you will say, damn it, this sucks really bad inside. And on the outside, you will say, I am so sorry. Thank you for pointing this out to me. I'm going to try to do better. And you're going to get good at that by practicing the new reflex, by working out the new muscle. And yes, it sucks. But just like you get sore when you go to the gym, nobody really, really loves the feeling of the really super intense workout because it just hurts. And sometimes you'll pull a muscle, but you got to keep in the game.
Thank you, Dr. Jana. Thank you. Okay, can you address that person who's listening who says, I'm not in a managerial role, I'm not in a leadership role. What am I going to do to call out subtle acts of exclusion in the workplace? I don't have that much influence where I work.
Yeah, so we all have the capacity to lead from where we stand. Even if you're a new person who just walked in 2 weeks ago, how you move through the workplace does have an influence on the culture. Even if you are trying your darndest to just show up, do what you need to do, interact with no one, collect your check and leave, you're still making an imprint on the culture, even by trying not to. So we do have the ability to influence. I think that, when it comes to subtle acts of exclusion, the greatest gift that we can give each other is to try to create these SAE accountability systems. So no, I do not encourage people to run up to their CEOs and call them out at every available opportunity. But this is where beginning where you stand, beginning where you sit is the most powerful thing that you can do, because as you gain a greater understanding and increase your own cultural fluency, as you begin to practice the muscles of becoming less defensive and becoming more curious, you'll start to make a mark as being an ally, right? You don't have to call people out, but you can certainly stand up in defense of someone, right? So if you're in that meeting when Susan gets asked to take the notes and you're an ally, you don't have to say, hey, Joe, you're a freaking jerk. Why would you do that? All you have to do is say, you know what, Susan, if I'm totally okay with doing it if you don't want to. That's an ally behavior. So there are levels to these things, right? Calling out and canceling people is like one extreme. And the other one is just being, sort of quietly and gently being an ally in the moment when we observe. Like I think we have a chapter in there that talks about moving from inactive bystander to being an ally, right? To being an active ally. And most of us have witnessed problematic behavior and we've been scared to do anything or say anything. So we just kind of let it go. And so what I would say is, as somebody who doesn't feel like they have a lot of power in the organization, it's not your job to single-handedly fix everything, and you don't have to address every single thing that comes up. However, I believe that our higher self and our spirit self is always paying attention. And when you get the visceral, ew, when something happens and you go, ooh, that is literally your higher self saying, you know what? You should probably say something. You should probably do something. And that doesn't mean, making yourself a martyr in the middle of the meeting. How about after the meeting, you go up to Patrick and you say, hey, Patrick, I saw what happened in the meeting. Are you okay? that's an ally behavior. That is something that you can do. You see a microaggression, you don't have to call every person out, but every single one of us can do something at some point.
To end, Dr. Jana, you've covered a lot of ground. You've given people a lot of possibilities for conversations they can have, actions they can take. I clearly got my homework. Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a great opportunity for me. Burning inside, this is my opportunity. If you were to give people an invitation, a challenge for this next week between now and when we come back together a week from now for part 3 of our series, a challenge where they could put some of what they've learned here in this session about embracing diversity in our communities into action, what might be just one or two open kind of challenges that you could throw out for people to take?
Oh man, I wish we were not in the COVID times, because I'd get people out in the world. But without being able to get out in the world, I would activate your antenna and activate your spidey senses and start training yourself to hear the feedback, right? Start training yourself to hear the feedback. Now, hopefully you have enough contact with enough people where you can begin to do that. But people will reflect you back at yourself pretty often, but we are so afraid and so defensive that we tune it out. So I would say put your antenna up and listen for anything that passes, for even the tiniest amount of feedback about who you are and how people are responding to you. Nothing is too small. And in those moments, I want you to take the time to reflect and take it in, because we're really good at dismissing the small feedback, and sometimes the big, we just dismiss it because we have our self identities and we're fine, and people are just defensive. People are just, they're extra. Take it in and explore the defensive response and explore moving into that curious and grateful space.
Thank you, Dr. Jana. Our final and third session is next week. It's Wednesday, July 8th, same time. We'll begin at 8 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. Pacific Time. We'll be looking at healing racism at a global scale in the world. Come join us. Sounds true. Walking together and waking up the world.